We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles McKenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip. When it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
Hey, warmer from the low. Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Soups with myself, Greg Eaps Peterson, now part of the Beeson Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you guys. We're going to be joined in a few minutes by our good friend Rob Donaldson, who does great work with the show/podcast Rob's Best Bets, and he is going to be joining me for two parts because we really didn't see a lot of news and notes in college basketball on Saturday, so we are going to be chatting with him about what he all noticed with regards to the NBA draft decisions that we saw last week, and we're going to be taking a look at a few teams that we're just intrigued by for this upcoming season. We're certainly going to be touching upon Texas A&M, a few of these teams that they've got some coaching moves. He's going to be mentoring a team out there in the Ohio Valley Conference that he is liking as well, so always a lot of fun with Rob. We're going to be joined by him here in a minute or two, and if you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways to offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, letters they mean does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline, and the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated, and then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. While I did not get in any Twitter/X questions today, everything is powered by Edge Boost. Over at Edge Boost, they make sure that bettors are able to access their funds 24/7, 365. It's an account that makes sure that all gambling transactions are approved every single time, and when you go to edgeboost.bet, type in that promo code of Greg, G-R-E-G. That'll get you $1 for $1 match on your first deposit up to $25. Now, let's touch upon everything that we're seeing in college basketball right now with our good friend Rob Donaldson, who does such great work being able to gauge this sport all 12 months out of the year. You go to his YouTube feed, youtube.com/Rob Donaldson, has great betting videos over there. And if you go to his Twitter/X feed at RobDFB, always does a great job posting up his bets, as he's doing a lot during the baseball season as well. And Rob, always great to get you aboard. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Greg. And it's a very exciting time for, I think, college basketball, because we just saw the NBA draft declaration deadline kind of go through, where people have to either declare and stay in the NBA draft pool or withdraw and go back to school. And what I kind of saw from it was a lot of encouragement. And I don't know about your stance, but, I like that college basketball is almost being, propped up with this new wave of NIL, entertaining a lot of the best players in the sport.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, and I've been saying this on the podcast last week, and I think that it's worth repeating. Out of all the winners and losers in college basketball, for one, there's been many more winners than losers over the last 2 to 3 years, ever since NIL really came into the forefront. And for two, I just feel like the biggest winners here are college basketball as a whole, because you do have so many of these guys that would be late first, early second round picks returning to school because arguably they can make more money in school rather than at the pros.
Right, and some of the critiques I've even seen so far are, well, how are these NBA teams loaded with money and trying to hoard all this talent gonna formulate these G League rosters and their Summer League rosters? And I just feel like, again, that's kind of that hoarding mentality of they want to have the pick of the litter. They just want to be overloaded with talent, so they don't really need to scout and pick their spots when the draft comes around, rather than actually allowing these college basketball players to develop within the sport of college basketball. And nowadays just kind of make money, make a career out of basketball for as long as they can with racking up those NIL benefits.
Oh, absolutely. I'm right there with you. And I do think that it's so interesting what we've got in terms of guys that are going to be coming back as well, because I want to get your thoughts here. I want to keep this open for them. Which decision did you think was the most impactful in terms of where the team would have been without him versus where they are now? Because I seem to think that actually Joshua Hubbard would probably be my answer for this, because with Joshua Hubbard, if he wasn't on Mississippi State, I don't know where they'd be in the SEC. With them, I think that they're going to be rock solid. Is there a player or two that you think of that they just made a big giant sway in general through their team's hopes this upcoming season?
Well, you went with kind of the benefit of a player coming back to school, but let me throw at you one that I think maybe or maybe not wasn't a surprise, depending on how dialed you are into like the NBA draft process. But Cedric Howard was supposed to be the guy at Duke to step in and replace Cooper Flagg, and he was a lengthy, athletic scorer who could really kind of multiply his positional versatility. And unfortunately, now he's staying in the NBA draft because he received rave reviews after that last year at Washington State and at the previous year at Eastern Washington. And I just feel like now when you're looking at all the talent that left Duke and the talent that they kind of got set back within the portal, I don't want to say that, oh, Duke has fallen on hard times. They won't be able to formulate a talented roster, but they definitely are a little bit of a step back in comparison to, the start of this sort of era now after Coach K.
Yeah, it's sort of like, oh no, instead of going to SDK Steakhouse, they have to dine at Texas Roadhouse tonight. What a tragedy. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, but it is very interesting with Duke. And how about another blue blood school that I feel like they just have had a bad offseason? Kansas, because Duke was able to steal one of the guys that it looked like was going to be going to Kansas. I don't feel like they've done necessarily an amazing job here in the transfer portal. Like Melvin Council is a solid player, but this just doesn't look like the sort of roster you'd expect out of Kansas, and I feel like they just have had a rough go of it in general here in the offseason.
Yeah, and this is kind of an interesting thing to monitor about all of these traditional powers in the sport of basketball that maybe don't have, I guess, like the crazy national branding outside of just the sport of basketball. Because to your point, when there was no NIL involved, Kansas was getting the pick of the litter, whether it was, in the transfer portal or through the freshman classes or just kind of in general in terms of players staying within the program, despite maybe having a lot of opportunities elsewhere. And now, yeah, to your point, you look at Trey White, Melvin Council, sure, those are pretty good gets, but when you're looking at, Zeke Mayo deciding to stay within the draft, AJ Storr leaving the program, which, you can kind of weigh however you want, Rylan Griffin, David Coit, these are guys that, are contributing players and talented players, and if you're not replacing them with somebody, I feel like, again, you have a traditional blue blood that's kind of behind the eight ball, and I don't really know where they go from here.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, and that's going to be an interesting team to monitor moving forward. As joining me on the show, we do have Rob Donaldson, who does great work with the show/podcast, Rob's Best Bets, over on youtube.com/Rob Donaldson, joining me right here on Coast to Coast Soups. And how do you take a look at the overall landscape of the Big 12? Because for the Big 12, I feel like they've had maybe a little bit of a down-off season. Maybe I'm just taking a look at it in the lens of the ACC had so many good coaching hires. The Big Ten really did a good job this offseason, and the SEC just continues to be winning. But it feels like for the Big 12, other than Houston, who gets back Milos Uzan, I think that that's very big for them. Teams like Arizona, teams like Kansas, even Iowa State, they haven't had it a ton here in the transfer portal. I feel like they've had a little bit of a lesser offseason compared to a lot of those other power conferences.
Yeah, and when you look at even a team like a Texas Tech that made it deep into the tournament, almost kind of should have went a little bit farther, but, blew a late lead, and now all of a sudden you look at the roster that they had last season to kind of make that run. Darian Williams, NC State, Devin Cambridge going out to UCF, Kevin Overton going to Auburn, Fede Federico going to Texas A&M. Those are prominent programs, but at the same time, you would think that Texas Tech, after a year of success, after having a kind of a rich, I would say, last 10 years of history within the basketball program, would have a chance to retain some of their top talent. And it just hadn't come to fruition. Even right now we're kind of waiting on, again, that ruling of whether or not certain players can have an extra year of eligibility. But even a guy like an Elijah Hawkins has entered the portal. So if that ruling does pass, well, he's probably not playing his basketball at Texas Tech unless something changes in his mind. And that's where I really don't understand, I guess, how some of these, traditional powers or even just powers that have risen over the last 20 years are going to continue to perform when the money really does talk in this sport right now.
Yep, I'm right there with you, and I do think that it's going to be very fascinating to see what happens with those players moving forward, because we are very much looking at that court ruling, and hopefully it goes away in which we get even more talent in the just sport in general, because I think that this is setting up to be a very good year, and I do think that this team is also very intriguing, because I talked about it with the SEC and the way that they just continue to be winning. One of the big losers I do take a look at is Arkansas, because even though Boogie Flan returned to school, he decided that he was going to be going to Florida instead. They do get Knox back in the fold, but they do lose Abdi Thiero as well, and I think that this is a Arkansas program that is going to be one of very much intrigue with John Calipari. In my opinion, actually a little bit overachieving last year, as weird as it is to say, but a lot of the chemistry is going to be gone from this previous year with so many guys deciding to not return.
And if any coach can kind of handle that year-over-year roster turnover, I'm going to put my money on Coach Cal because, again, he came into last season without a roster. He had that famous quote of, I met with the team, there is no team. And, when he was at Kentucky, well, he had freshmen come in abundance, 10 per year, and all of a sudden 9 of them would go to the pros. And I just feel like in this roster, this NIL era, him, Sean Miller, a lot of these guys that are traditionally, used to dealing with the one and dones have really kind of branched into acquiring talent in the NIL era. And obviously they have a leg up when the administration is behind them and throwing money around. I do feel like some way, somehow, Arkansas is going to formulate a roster, and I do think that Coach Cal has this kind of blueprint in his bag to at least be competitive yet again in the SEC.
Yep, I think so as well, and I do think that he's going to be able to do a very solid job moving forward on that front as well, and I do think that with just the SEC in general, it's going to be an almighty conference once again, and I want to get your thoughts on this SEC because I do think that Florida has a good chance to be able to win the conference once again this year with the fact that they bring back their entire front court along with as well bringing in Boogie Fland, who we just mentioned, but also Auburn is an interesting team because I don't think that they're going to be where they were a season ago, but bringing back Taj Pettiford, I thought was one of the biggest moves that we saw in the portal process and the NBA draft process because I was talking about it. I thought that Joshua Hubbard was an impact guy, but if Auburn didn't have Todd Pettiford, I thought that there was going to be a very, very steep drop off for them from a season ago. Now I think that it's only going to be a little bit more minor.
Yeah, and obviously, when you're looking at Auburn and the crazy run that they went on and how dominant they looked at times under Bruce Pearl, the question is, how does Bruce Pearl get over that hump with all of these championship type of teams and really only having 2 runs over the past, 2 decades or so within the SEC. And I do feel like, again, if you're going to be still accumulating talent in the NIL era, you're going to have yourself a shot. Last year, they definitely had a shot, and they have, acquired talent this offseason again with Kevin Overton, Keyshawn Murphy, Keyshawn Hall, and I really do think that that's not even the rest of it to come. And also, when you're looking at the SEC in totality, hey, shout out to Buckyball, right? I mean, Texas Tech, or Texas A&M rather, was kind of left with what do we go from here after Buzz Williams left, and all they've done is acquire talent. Now, sometimes talent, too many cooks in the kitchen might be an issue, and certainly I could see that being an issue in year one with how many point guards and ball first guys that they have. But if somehow they can all gel together, who's to say that Texas A&M isn't actually the most talented team in the SEC right now?
Yeah, it's really interesting with Texas A&M because I've been asking this question on the podcast the last few days. What can we expect out of that style? Because it doesn't feel like the roster that you can really run the same style that he had over at Samford, but how that is going to be translating to this season, I think is very interesting, and I think that that's worth mentioning on the flip side. We're going to talk a little bit more about Texas A&M. I know that there's a sleeper out there in the OVC that our good friend Rob wants to talk about, and we will be talking a little bit more about what we saw with regards to the draft decisions as well on the flip side right here on Coach Go Soups with myself, Greg Peterson, now a part of the Beast and Family Podcast. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Soups with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Great to be joined by Rob Donaldson, who does great work with the show/podcast Rob's Best Bets. You're able to follow him on his Twitter/text feed at RobDFB, and we were chatting with him a little bit about Texas A&M on the other side. And how about if we do dive in on this a little bit further, because we talked about the fact that they've got Pipe Isaacs. We talked about the fact that they've got so much talent in general, but I just genuinely don't know how this is going to be looking for them this season, and I think that just leads to a lot of variance with this team because I don't know if we're going to see Bucky McMillan be able to run the same style out there in the SEC. They just become, for me, a little bit of a wild card in general just because I think that there's a high ceiling, I think that there's a low floor, and there's just a lot of unknown with this team.
Yeah, and, to that point, Pop Isaacs, I do feel like you always have to have a glue guy when you are bringing in this many type of talented dudes who want their share of the rock. And Pop Isaacs has always kind of been a guy where he's competing defensively. He's a good facilitator. He makes smart decisions for the most part. He does have the turnover issues that I feel like every ball dominant guard does have. but he's also going to be sharing the lane with Jakari Lane, who, we saw him at North Alabama. Who's to know what his playing time will be in the SEC, but this was a guy who was touching the ball nearly every single possession and taking most of the shots. Rylan Griffin was a guy who left Kansas to kind of fill up a bigger role at his next stop, presumably, and a lot of other dudes who have transferred from mid-major programs and kind of lower-tier programs within the major conferences that are also wanting to kind of ball out in their final season. I feel like this is going to be similar to the Louisville case of, you have a bunch of talent. How does it gel? I'm not certain that, all these guys are going to gel, but if just enough of them do, again, I feel like this is going to be a team that really asserts himself very early on in the season.
And I'm so glad that you bring that up, as Rob Donaldson, who does great work with the show/podcast, Rob's Best Bets, is joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops. For a few other teams that you look at that, much like I have my question marks with this Texas A&M team, I don't necessarily know how it looks, but you just like the talent there in general, and you think that they might be able to overperform just because they do have that raw talent, and they've done a nice job here in the portal bringing in these guys.
I definitely look at a team like an NC State, and I know that this is definitely a cop-out, but at the same time, when you have Trey Holloman coming, you have Alan Breed, you bring over some guys from McNeese, you have Darian Williams, Terrence Arsenault, Van Allen Lubin, you have a lot of talent and a really good head coach, and I know this is going to be the trendy team of the offseason that everybody wants to fall in love with, the gunslinger, Will Wade, and what he's able to do in year one in an ACC that feels a little bit wide open, and I do think that NC State is going to be a tournament team, and I think they're going to have immediate success along the lines of Pat Kelsey. But I'm going to actually show you a different one that maybe I don't know how it's going to play out, but I think that there is that upside that you were kind of speaking to. That's Kansas State. And they had the similar approach last offseason. It absolutely bottomed out. Couldn't have gone more wrong with all the talented kind of my ball guys that they acquired, and none of them really gelled together outside of just Coleman Hawkins going out there and doing his thing. Well, now they got PJ Haggerty from Memphis. They got Nate Johnson from Akron, and they got Abdi Bashir from Monmouth. All of these dudes were the primary ball handler and primary shooters at their last stop. And again, did Kansas State dig themselves in a hole? I kind of lean that way, but at the same time, if this unit can mesh together, I think this is a team that can really compete in the Big 12.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and they bring in mostly mid-major guys, which I also find to be very interesting, so they needed to get PJ Haggerty in the fold. I thought that was very important for them, and I do think that these teams are going to be looking to mix and match, are going to be some of the biggest ones in all of college basketball, because we did see Kansas State add quite a bit late in the portal process, and I do think that with Michigan, they're such an intriguing team as well, because they added Yaxel Lindyborg, who it looked like he was going to be as good as gone to the NBA draft. The big issue with Michigan was obviously turning the ball over, Elliot Cadeau coming in, and I do think that even though a lot of people are down on Cadeau, he's just exactly what Michigan needs, a guy that's not going to turn the ball over, and I think that team is perhaps a sleeping giant out there in the Big Ten where they're probably going to be behind Purdue, but other than Purdue, I don't know if there's another team that's better than them.
Yeah, and to your point, Michigan needed to replace size, and they needed to add a guard, and I would have liked if they would have added a little bit more perimeter scoring, because this still feels like more of a one-dimensional type of team, but that one dimension, when you have Ade Mara, Yaxel Lindenborg, and even Morez Johnson, who's now in the fold, that's a pretty good one dimension. It can get you pretty far. I think Elliot Cadeau is going to be that X factor, and how do you value that in terms of, the betting front or how they're going to perform throughout the season? This wouldn't be a team that I just jump right out on and expect similar results to how they finish the year. But at the same time, if they get caught, in a heater early, I'm not going to be off that train. I'm probably going to be buying more stock than not. And I think when you have a coach that's been there and done that with so many talented rosters, that also helps out too.
Yeah, no question about it. I think that they're going to be a fun team to watch. And one other team that I think is so interesting, because I've been down on them the last few years because they don't play any defense, but Alabama bringing back LeBaron Phelan, I thought was absolutely massive, because he pretty much said that he was gone. We all thought that he was going to be leaving Alabama. We know that with Alabama, it's going to be a little bit of a new look team this season, but how do you take a look at them now that they get one of their main guys back? He was so good as a freshman, and they've got Latrell Wrightsell back after he was injured last season. Granted, you don't have as much versatility down in the post, but I do think that this backcourt has a chance to be one of the best in all of college basketball, with again the question mark being, can they, for the love of Pete, play a little bit of defense?
And that's really what it comes down to, man, because we saw from even Houston at the end of the year and from Florida to make the national championship, and even Texas Tech, who overexceeded expectations once they got in the field, was that balance. Heck, even Michigan State, you can throw them in the mix. There wasn't a lot of teams that just had that one gear to go that got it done or made it even further in the tournament past the Sweet 16. And that's still going to be the thing that's always going to be kind of hanging on Nate Oates is it doesn't really matter how much talent he has, because year by year, the offensive output, it really stays relatively similar. It's not like one year is a complete spike because of the NIL addition or element added into recruiting, or, just kind of not having those recruits and just kind of working on what you had from, your regular roster or from the high school ranks. It's always relatively similar on the offensive end. It's just about shoring up that defensive end. And until I see it from a lot of these coaches who fall into that mold, I'm not going to believe it. But at the same time, Alabama's still going to be good. I know they're going to win games. It's just a matter of how many games they can actually win when it really matters.
Yeah, they're going to be such an interesting team. And Rob, I'll give you the floor here. Is there any other team, whether it be involving NBA draft decisions, what they've done here in the past few weeks in the transfer portal, what have you, that you're just intrigued about? You don't necessarily know if they're going to be amazing. You don't necessarily know if they're going to be awful, but you just have question marks and you want to see how it pans out, and you're trying to evaluate them as best as you can.
Well, let me throw a little bit of a curveball at you. I'm going to highlight a mid-major out of the OVC of all conferences, and we're going to be taking a look at Southern Indiana. And the reason why I think Southern Indiana is such an interesting school, and, last year in the OVC, we saw teams kind of rise out of nowhere. SIUE was an immediate riser. SEMO was kind of an immediate riser. And Southern Indiana is now kind of getting their feet wet within Division I college hoops. And they're actually attacking the portal for whatever it's worth. And they're adding guys who I actually thought were pretty talented last year. I look at an Ahmad Wagner from UTEP, who actually really did well in the CUSA conference tournament and really performed at a high level on the smaller side, but a really good scoring guard. And they've added now about 3 or 4 of kind of elite-esque scorers from the mid-major level as sort of lateral or down transfers. I mean, if you are looking for a team that can be a surprise, quote-unquote, out of nowhere, I would take a look at Southern Indiana and see if you can't catch lightning in a bottle.
I really like what they were able to add, and they had some nice wins last season as well with the Southern Indiana team. I do think that there's quite a bit of upside with them out there in an OVC that obviously is down from when they have Murray State, Belmont, what have you, but Ahmad Bynum is a guy that's really able to light it up from three-point range. They add in there Shadarian Sharp. I know that he was a pretty rock-solid player out there in the Missouri Valley Conference as well. They've done a nice job here. A little bit of an undersized team, but I do think that they're going to be able to lend some value moving forward, just like you always do, my friend. Rob, you're doing a tremendous job taking a look at this great game of college basketball. I know this time of year you're tearing it up on the baseball front as well, so let the good people at home know it's on tap for you. I know people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Well, hey, Greg, it's always a blast to talk college hoops with you. It almost feels like it's that season again, even though we have a lot of months to go, my friend. But hey, once we're there, I'm going to be riding with you. And for those who are wanting to follow my Major League Baseball bets or my college hoops bets once the season comes into fold, you can do so on my Twitter/X at RobDFB, and also on my YouTube channel, which is just my name, Rob Donaldson. But as always, Greg, I appreciate you having me on, man.
It's always great to be able to get Rob aboard. He does such an amazing job taking a look at this wonderful game of college basketball, and every single time he joins me, lends such great insight. So a big thanks to Rob for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, part of the VSiN family of podcasts. And if you do like what you're hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, whatever you for this podcast, you have one of 2 ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, Larry CM, name does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. Otherwise, find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. Big thanks once again to our good friend Rob for joining me in last segment. And I'm with you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season. So I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.